we going to talk about this book?
Mm-hmm.
I'm super excited. So for people who don't know, Julie is Rotational's 2025 summer engineering intern. And she's doing kind of an applied statistics, sort of data science applied statistics project. But one of the things that I thought might be interesting to assign to her, to our intern, is to coordinate a book club. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're reading Chip Huyen's latest O'Reilly book, AI Engineering. It's really fascinating for me. I've been doing this for over 10 years. So, in like LLM years, that's very old. But there's stuff in here that I haven't encountered before, which is really interesting. I think it's sort of a function of the fact that we're part of two different cultures. She's sort of that West Coast culture, and I don't know what I am, sort of this academic East Coast, maybe data science culture. But that's been really cool because there are a lot of ideas in here that I've thought about from a different perspective and maybe have a slightly different framing on personally with how I think about some of these issues. But there's also a lot of alignment, and I think she's really smart. I've finished chapter 2. I've started reading chapter 3, which is on evaluation. I'm already really glad that we're reading this together.
So in the first chapter of AI engineering, Huyen talks a lot about all of the different possible use cases for AI and all the different things that can be automated with it to make labor more productive and save costs for a lot of companies. And this kind of relates to the bigger question of how AI will be replacing workers in the future. And as someone in college right now, it's a pretty pressing question for me. And even reading chapter 1 and seeing the variety of the use cases, a lot of those are the traditional careers that people used to have for their entire life. But now that those are being replaced by AI, it's raising a lot of questions about how the workforce will look in the future. So in chapter 1, Huyen writes, if the risk is that AI can replace many skills, the opportunity is that AI can be used as a tutor to learn any skill. For many skills, AI can help someone get up to speed quickly and then continue learning on their own to become better than AI. So she basically is arguing that we shouldn't worry too much about AI replacing workers, because even if old jobs are replaced, then AI can be used to train people for new jobs. So to counter this point, I was reminded of this book that I read a couple of years ago called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century that's written by historian and author Yuval Noah Harari. And he discusses the future potential job market and how it's going to be impacted by the rapid technological advances, especially in AI. And so he writes that the problem with all such new jobs, however, is that they will probably demand high levels of expertise and will therefore not solve the problem of unemployed, unskilled laborers. He also writes, even if we constantly invent new jobs and retrain the workforce, we might wonder whether the average human would have the emotional stamina necessary for a life of such endless upheavals. So the question that I want to ask is, do you think that the future job market will be able to produce new long-term careers for workers? And do you think these workers that do not have the skills that employers necessarily want to hire, will they be able to adapt to these newer high-skilled jobs that are replacing the old ones?
It's hard to say from where we're sitting right now how much is actually going to change. There's a lot of pieces of what you said that I want to respond to. So one of the pieces is sort of this idea of these new kind of more highly technical jobs that people might not be skilled for. And I think that it's maybe, it's more just I think there's kind of this, this expectation to always be producing more. And so it's more about time compression. So as technology becomes more advanced, there's more pressure to be as productive as possible with your time units. And if those are work time units where somebody is subsidizing that work time, they want you to be as productive as possible. And so what what will actually change, I think, is less so, like a whole bunch of tools that magically solve problems, and more so it changes the expectation that you should be able to get this email done in this amount of time versus whatever it used to take. And that people who can leverage tools to make it faster to write emails will be seen as better at time compression than other people. And that might be associated with you wanting to, them having more value on the market, if we're kind of using purely economic terms, which again is kind of barf, but like, because that's not really how anything actually works in practice. But like, that's the general gist, right? That if you can compress more into, a shorter amount of time, that, it's paradoxical, because like you would think that if you were like producing for a longer period of time, that's what you actually want to value. But like the actual value is like, how much can you get done? How many different jobs can you do? How many different hats can you wear? How many different types of emails can you send? Can you send ones to customers as well as your internal engineers, as well as to your mother, as well as to potential investors, as well as to, your project manager and your intern, and, all of those things. So I think that that's part of what I want to say, is that I am skeptical that there will be kind of all of a sudden this whole host of new tools that automatically solve problems. I think what changes first is the sort of expectation, like, why does this take so long? And then when people are like, why does this take so long? That creates a market incentive for tool creation. So I think that the job of us is really just to make sure that we complain the loudest, right? So the things that we complain about are the things that the market will try to address. So the things that bother us that we want to spend less time doing, the theory is, according to, I guess, like kind of basic economics, is that if we make it clear that those are things that would help us compress our time more in work units, there's like a dollar value, then those are the things that will be addressed through technology. So I think the other part of that what you said that I wanted to talk about is this idea that somehow that AI is not reaching certain kinds of people and it is reaching other kinds of people, this idea of unskilled laborers. So I used to work at the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Actually, it was my first job out of my PhD program. And I mean, it's kind of grim, to be honest with you. It's a government job. And like every day, basically, they publish a list of all the people who got killed at work the last day. And the way that people get killed at work is mostly they fall off a roof because their job didn't give them the protector, like the fall protection that they needed. They get killed in a factory where something was not, like a machine wasn't guarded the way that it was supposed to be. They fall off a cell tower. Or like, they die a slow, horrible death because they get exposed to chemicals, or they like hurt their back while picking patients up in a hospital. That's like a surprisingly dangerous job, is working in a hospital, just because like you can slip on things, you can get attacked, like it's extremely dangerous. So like when you really think about the work that people are doing out there in the world, I think sometimes it's easy to just fixate on knowledge work because that's kind of like what we're closest to. But when you think about all of the jobs that people are doing out there, cell towers and roofers and nurses and, steel plant manufacturer, people who work in manufacturing, there are tons of applications of AI that are already in process. Like, any little bit of guarding that you can do, anything that you can do to offload a very dangerous task that like used to require somebody's fingers to go into a machine. If you can do that with cameras or sensors, like that seems more humane to me than using fingers. So I think that I don't really hear that being part of the conversation when I hear about this idea of like unskilled labor. But I think that that's kind of what people mean when they're talking about people who work at like McDonald's who are frying French fries. That's incredibly dangerous, right? Like that, if that oil touches your skin, it will burn you. So like, is that unskilled labor? Like maybe according to like some classification, but it's also very skilled labor because you have to be skilled enough. You have to skill your employees. You have to teach them how to not get hurt. And a lot of employers don't follow the law. So like, I do kind of like the idea that there could be some technologies that are just kind of baked into infrastructure and into kind of industry and manufacturing such that they make work safer for humans. But I mean, again, like not that also won't just happen magically. We have to focus on the right things and build things in the right way. We need to automate the things that are the right things. So there's still a lot of choice involved. It's not just as simple as like go with the flow. How far back in a conversation do you have to remember to sort of have a real conversation with somebody?
At the start of the conversation, I guess.
So yeah, like this conversation, I think you don't have to go back all the way to the beginning. Like we probably could pick it up from maybe when we started actually looking at the reading group notes. Mm-hmm. But like we don't have to go all the way back to the conversation we had yesterday about simple closet. Mm-hmm. Right? But like the fact that when I said simple closet, you smiled because like there is something important about remembering something that happened pretty far back in the conversation. What does it signal?
That you're paying attention.
Yeah. And that's really important. So like the trick is, how do you do that without the human? Like, mm-hmm. How do you signal that you're paying attention? And they tried to basically come up with an algorithmic way to sort of signal that you're paying attention. And mm-hmm. It's called the attention mechanism. So that's kind of like the high level. I was going to sort of talk a little bit about, since this is, about Chip's book, and I do feel like I should, mention that I am looking at her book now. I'm looking at page 60, 61, and 62 are kind of the main parts here about the attention mechanism. So this is in chapter 2. She's talking about the transformer architecture. And the transformer architecture was sort of this big shift away from the way we used to do things in the olden days with language models, where we were using things like, recurrent neural networks and stuff like that. So the transformer architecture is like a totally different approach to thinking about how to solve the problem of language modeling. And it depends on this thing called the attention mechanism. And so she's sort of breaking down the attention mechanism. So she says there's this query vector, and then there's a key vector, and then there's a value vector. So the query vector is Q. She says that represents the current state of the decoder at each decoding step. The key vector represents the previous token, and the value vector represents the actual value of the previous token. As learned by the model. So I think that like that is a little bit abstract, probably, right? So I was thinking, okay, well, what if we kind of played around with a little bit of a metaphor here to see if we could build a mental model of like what is actually happening in this? It's like, what is the mechanism? What is the actual mechanism behind attention? So I was thinking, okay, let's think about the model as a whole as maybe a PhD advisor for a multidisciplinary research department. So we've got this kind of PhD advisor, and the PhD advisor has at her disposal a bunch of grad students who she can send out to do work on her behalf, right? So in that kind of metaphor, the query vector would be like one of the grad students. And so we've got kind of like a grad student that is writing a literature review about some research paper. Maybe it's attention is all you need. And then the key vector is going to be like the title of the article that the grad student is looking at and trying to determine. Basically, it's a question of like, is this relevant to, like, is this something that my PhD advisor wants me to be looking at? Is this valuable? Is this relevant? And so we've got kind of like, what we have access to is grad students who can sort of ask these questions, like, is this relevant? They can look through the content for us. We have, a card catalog with all of the titles that are, or maybe it's like JSTOR or whatever, the, pub science, whatever, PubMed, one of the, the big repositories of articles, right? So they've got all of those and they're all ordered by name. So you can search by name. And then the value vector is actually the full text of the article in this metaphor. So then what we're going to do is we're going to compute something. So let's see, I'm looking now on 61. The attention mechanism computes how much attention to give an input token by performing a dot product between the query vector and its key vector. So the query vector, again, that represents the grad student that is doing kind of the lit review. So this is the grad student who's asking the question. And then it's the dot product between the query vector and the key vector, which is the title of the article. Attention is all you need, right? So if the dot product that comes back is a high score, it means the model will use more of that page's content. So it'll use more of the full text from the value vector when generating the summary of the, of the literature review. So like when we're doing a literature review about the history of transformers, you would expect that the paper Attention is All You Need would have a very high dot product, right? That would be kind of your intuition. Conversely, so Chip doesn't say this, but it might be helpful to think about what a low score means in this case also. So in this case, a low score means that the article is not at all relevant to the lit review. So like, let's say it's an article about fashion or something like Paris Fashion Week, right? So it's, obviously a very interesting article in some other context, but it is not relevant to the literature review that the grad student is doing on behalf of their PhD advisor right now. So I think another thing that's sort of important to think about is that in this multidisciplinary department, every time the professor, the kind of the model, this PhD advisor, every time they have to write a new literature review for a new paper, how many grad students do they need to ask to build the literature review?
All of them?
They need all of them every single time. So I feel like that's sort of an interesting thing that people might not really realize is that one of the reasons that these models are kind of one of their flaws, I guess, is that very thing, right? Like you can't just use a subset of the department to answer to build the literature review, right? Sort of the attention mechanism sort of depends on saying like, all of these grad students will all do this research together and then we'll combine the results we'll mathematically combine all of the results. So you have to use everybody every time. So that also means that none of your grad students are specialized in any like specific part of the domain, but they are going to be specialized in some ways. And so if you kind of flip to the next page, Chip talks about this a little bit, where she talks about how the attention mechanism is almost always multi-headed. Multiple heads allow the model to attend to different groups of previous tokens simultaneously. So for example, and it's not going to ever be this simple, but like in theory, there might be like one grad student who is paying attention to something like how many times they use adverbs in the text, or if it's sarcastic, like if it seems like the text is sarcastic, or if the text is in French or Russian or English. So like each of the heads can be, in theory, paying attention to a different subset of features of the language, but those subsets are not things that we as humans can reason about in the way that we can reason about something like, okay, there's the chemistry department and they're good at solving chemistry problems and they're experts at chemistry. Whereas like the geology program, they're experts in geology. And like, if you have a geology question, you go ask the geology department. This is like, this sort of is not that anymore. It's like this big super department where everybody is sort of like mediocre at everything, but like at everything, if that makes sense. Like the trade-off is being mediocre at everything, even things that are like really far away from things that you went to school for. Whereas like, you know, in the model where you have domain-specific models, you have maybe a model that is expert at, you know, geology and expert in chemistry, expert in English, expert in French. And if you need an expert, that makes way more sense, because if you use a big foundation model, because of the attention mechanism, basically what you should expect is that you will have this big, totally homogenous group of grad students at your service who are doing research, but they're not specialists in anything, at least not anything that you could discern. Like they're, you know, they are multi-headed, but it's not like the heads are like different things that you would be able to reason about as a person. And so the heads aren't particularly helpful for interpretation. So I think that, but I think it's like it's a helpful way to kind of maybe think about like how all of the pieces work together, and why it is that you need basically like a full GPU to run these kinds of models.
Okay, I have a question about the multiple heads of the attention mechanism. So you said that they can be specialized. So how should we think of them? Should we think of the multiple heads as pretty much identical all to each other, except in some very small details? When these multiple heads, when they do become specialized, even a little bit, does this happen naturally from just them learning on their own, or is that programmed into the attention mechanism?
So they are designed to be independently flexible. Have you ever seen one of those? I don't even know what these are called, but they're like the toys that you have as a kid where it's like made out of pins, and if you stick your hand into it, it pushes out the pins like in your handprint.
Mm-hmm.
So like imagine that each head is a little like, you know, 3x3 or I don't know, 6x6 pin matrix, where like you got the 6x6 and you could put your hand into this one, and there's another one you could put your hand into this one. So like each head is flexible. It has pins that can adjust to where the pressure, whatever pressure it needs. The actual like what pressures it's experiencing are not things that a human could reason about. So that they're kind of like in that representational mysticism space, where it's sort of a black box. But it will be sort of abstract features of language, probably things that we don't even have vocabulary for as humans, but like, things that we do statistically more frequently. What the model will pick up on is like statistical, frequencies.
So is each head kind of like picking up on its own statistical frequencies and learning off of that?
It is learning from the math, like the dot product math that's happening. And like the math that's happening is sort of independent on each head. And then like the results do come together at the end, but they are moving independently for all intents and purposes.
Have you personally noticed how so many social media platforms are just becoming flooded with AI generated content?
Yes, I have. And actually, I love this question that you asked. I actually want to read the whole question out because I think I had sort of an epiphany about this just recently. So you said many online platforms are becoming flooded with AI generated content. Huyen acknowledges this problem when she writes, AI's ability to write can also be abused. Many online users have a hard time distinguishing between human-made and AI-generated content. And this will become even more difficult as AI improves. Do you think that there will be a new tool to sort through AI-generated content for users? Do you think users will continue to prefer human-made content, or will users accept and want to consume AI content? So this is really fascinating because I have a lot of feelings. So on the one hand, I actually think it's wrong. So the claim that users have a hard time distinguishing, I actually think that's not true. I think that, I bet if I showed you two posts on LinkedIn and asked you which one you thought was more likely AI generated, I'm confident that you would be able to tell me 98% of the time. Do you agree?
I agree, but I just think when I was thinking of the people who have a hard time distinguishing between AI generated and human made content, I was definitely thinking of like the older population.
So
that
yeah,
is technologically advanced. And I was also inspired by a few like crazy Facebook posts that I saw that are like very obviously AI generated. And
yeah,
like human users are like commenting like as if it's any other post, and from what it seems like they
yeah.
aren't really aware that it's AI generated.
So I think there maybe is an age gap here, where there is an age where it is so and it might be people who are already retired who are not being exposed to as much AI generated content at work. Because when you see it at work, which we do, you and I see it on LinkedIn all day long. So you and I are very attuned to this right now. But if that's not something that's part of your everyday experience, then I think that it's very likely that you would have less discernment than somebody like you or me. And so I think that what's interesting is that I think this statement isn't quite right, but I think what's true is that like there is now a new value in that discernment that didn't exist before. And I think what's fascinating is that AI detectors don't work. So like that's really interesting. That means that there's something really special about you. You can read the two posts and you can tell me which one. But an AI, like these AI detectors are not finding success, right? Like people are showing kind of repeatedly how they are not able to effectively detect AI, either because they suffer from false positives where they say that the Declaration of Independence or something is plagiarized or is AI generated because it doesn't understand the difference between old data and like new data, or false negatives, so people actually are better now than AI at detecting AI generated content. I think that this will increase the value of sounding human in your writing. So people who are really good at cleverly signaling their humanity, I think people will crave that kind of content.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that people at work who seem more human will make more money.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that companies that seem more human will be able to capture market segments that feel alienated by things that seem mechanical and robotic.
Mm-hmm.
Like people, I think, will be willing to sometimes pay more for a human touch experience.
This makes me think of something I saw a few days ago on TikTok, actually, but there's this like sound that is really popular right now. And I think there's like a couple 100,000 videos made to that sound. And the interesting thing is that the entire song is AI generated, but it kind of like sounds like any other like song that you would just kind of have quietly playing in the background. And pretty much nobody's talking about the fact that it is AI generated. So that kind of just makes me think of like, I don't know, maybe people are good at detecting AI when they're conscious of the fact that it could be AI generated, but it's just usually people like to assume that it's made by humans.
Exactly. So the only thing that changes is like whether or not you believe it's a safe bet to make the assumption that something is human generated. But like back when I was in high school and Britney Spears released Hit Me Baby One More Time, it was outside of the realm of possibility to me in my mind at that time that she did not write that song. I assumed that she did. How else do songs get made? Like, of course, I just assumed that the people who sing songs on the radio write their songs also. And, you know, come to realize many years later that, of course, she did not write that song. Like, that song was produced by like some Swedish company or something that was like a hit maker, and she recorded it. And of course, like, she's amazing, has an amazing voice, was an amazing dancer, but she's not a writer. It's like this kind of thing has always been happening. This sort of like this realization that the rules that you thought existed don't exist. Where like you thought the rules were, you know, all writing comes from people, all pictures come from human artists, all songs come from, you know, the person who's singing the song wrote their own song. Like those ideas, it feels uncomfortable when you have to reevaluate one of those, because like those rules allow us to function and compress more time into more work units. You know, like you have to make assumptions, you have to be able to kind of take shortcuts. One of the shortcuts that people take is, oh, this, of course this is written by human, like what are you talking about? But that you can't use that shortcut anymore. And so especially if there's anything that's related to like security or privacy, you know, you have to err on the side of caution, because that thing that used to be obvious is no longer obvious. And that is uncomfortable. And it will disproportionately affect people who are, you know, not in the knowledge worker community, who aren't being exposed to this, people who are in the, you know, retired, who aren't being exposed to this at work every day. So this is stuff that I think it would be better if more people knew about this.
So you kind of think that as more people are just knowledgeable on what AI could generate, then they can become more skilled at detecting what's made by AI and what's made by humans.
Yeah, I think that being able to discern will be much more valuable as we go forward. And so getting good at being skeptical and having discernment will serve everybody well.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever been like stumped by an AI, like you thought that something was human generated and then you like took a closer look and realized that it's actually AI?
I think that all of my stories like that are stories of like where it's like they couldn't possibly be doing this. Like that is so unbelievable to me that they would do this. So like, for example, everybody tells the joke about don't say certain things in front of your phone.
Mm-hmm.
Because why do people say that? Like, what is the joke?
The phone is listening to them.
And like, why is it a joke?
Because you don't actually think that it's really listening to you.
But like, why do you think that? Because you're like, no, they couldn't possibly. That's so unethical that nobody would do that. But the reality is like, if they can, if there's not a law against it, and if it will make them money, it's already done. It already happened a long time ago. It's not something that they're thinking about doing. It's something that has existed already. If they can do it technologically, if there's no law against it, and if they can make money doing it, it's already true. And like that has been true of a lot of things for a long time. Like there's this really famous story about LinkedIn, and this is in like the old days of LinkedIn. So this is like probably 2008, I want to say. I think it's around that time that they started rolling out this feature of like people you might know. and it would recommend people that they thought might be in your network that you hadn't connected with yet.
Mm-hmm.
And people were freaked out because it would be like, it would recommend somebody that you just met the day before that you hadn't connected with. And it felt creepy, right? But it was algorithmic. But, and so it wasn't spying on people exactly, but it was sort of like, it was using recommender systems, and, large matrix multiplication to sort of figure out, like, statistically, if you know all these other people, you're probably going to end up meeting this other person who also lives in your same city and does the same job and goes to the same talks. You know what I mean? But it was creepy at first because it's like, wait a second, LinkedIn, are you spying on me? So I think that I guess what I have experienced in my lifetime is just a gradual, erosion of my expectations of, like, oh, they wouldn't do that. Like, oh, they would never use that to do, like, yes, they will.
They have.
They will, they have, they are. And so, like, the only thing that we can do is know about it
Mm-hmm.
and push back. And then what I try to do is I try to stay in engineering, even though there's so much bad stuff like that happening. Because good people have to stay in to make sure that we make some good things that are aligned with the kind of world that we want to live in. There are many, many times where I'm sure I've been served content that was targeted, that I'm sure I've been targeted with advertisements. I read a story about, young women being targeted by Facebook and Meta ads for beauty products, triggered by when they delete pictures off their phone. The idea being, like, those are moments of insecurity because she's deleting, and so you should try to exploit her while she's feeling insecure and get her to buy makeup. So I just assume that already is happening all the time, and it's not a nice feeling to feel. Like, I wish that I could live in a different world, but, like, going into all situations with that kind of skepticism, I think, is a more responsible way to be in the world that exists right now.